Sometime in 2025, on a cluster of roughly 50,000 domestic Chinese chips with no Nvidia hardware, no CUDA, and no export licensed accelerators anywhere in the stack, a company whose primary performance metric is whether your dumplings arrive in under 25 minutes finished training a 1.6 trillion parameter model. The pressure that was supposed to starve that training run did not stop it. It funded it. The chain runs from an export ban through a logistics platform to a training event that changes who the ban's leverage actually reaches. That model is called LongCat 1.6T, and its builder is Meituan, the dominant food delivery and consumer services operator in China. Keep that pairing in mind because it is going to recur. A delivery platform, a trillion parameter cluster, no Nvidia. That combination is the physical fact this entire chain rests on. Start at the beginning of the chain, which is also the most confirmed link. The United States progressively restricted the export of high-end Nvidia accelerators to Chinese entities. First the A100, then the H100, then the successive replacement chips that Nvidia engineered specifically to stay within the export thresholds. Each new restriction was met with a revision, and each revision was met with a tightened rule. That back and forth is confirmed public record, documented in successive orders from the Bureau of Industry and Security. The effect of those restrictions on the Chinese market is also confirmed broadly by industry reporting and company disclosures. Chinese cloud providers, state-affiliated research institutes, and domestic hardware manufacturers accelerated both procurement of whatever chips remained available and the development of alternatives. The result, by the time Meituan began assembling its cluster, was a domestic supply base of tens of thousands of accelerators available to enterprise buyers, chips produced inside China, sourced from vendors operating outside the scope of the export rules. The exact shipment volumes and the full vendor roster remain partially opaque, but the broad shape of that supply chain is not in dispute. That is Link 1. The restriction created the supply chain it was trying to prevent by giving domestic producers a captive market and a clear commercial incentive. Confirmed. Link 2 follows directly. That domestic accelerator supply became accessible to buyers who had never been the primary targets of the restriction. Not chip designers, not frontier AI laboratories, not the large cloud providers who were already visible on every analyst's watch list. Meituan assembled roughly 50,000 of those chips into a single training cluster and ran a training job that produced LongCat 1.6T. The company confirmed the training run and the approximate chip count in its own disclosures. What has not been detailed publicly is the specific vendor mix inside that cluster, the per-chip performance envelope, or whether the training run required engineering workarounds to maintain reliability at that node count. Those gaps matter, and they will come back, but the top-line fact is confirmed. A food delivery company built a cluster of that scale and completed a training run at a parameter count previously associated only with dedicated frontier labs. The chip count alone is a physical quantity worth pausing on. 50,000 accelerators arranged into a single coherent training system is not a weekend project. It is a procurement operation, a facilities operation, and an engineering operation that implies a level of organizational commitment far beyond what you would expect from a company whose public identity is built around delivery time optimization. That is Link 2. Confirmed. And it raises an immediate question. Why does a food delivery platform need a 1.6 trillion parameter model? This is where the analogy earns its one appearance in this chain. Think of what an agentic-commerce system actually has to do. It needs to hold in working memory, simultaneously, every restaurant's menu, every courier's location, every customer's payment credential, and real-time routing information across a city, then make thousands of individual decisions per second without a human approving each step. A smaller model in that environment is like a dispatcher who keeps putting callers on hold to check a reference binder. At some transaction volume, the time spent consulting the binder costs more than the binder saves. Meituan processes hundreds of millions of consumer transactions annually. At that volume, the parameter count stops being a benchmark aspiration and becomes, according to the company's own account, an operational requirement. That account is Link 3, and its certainty grade is reported, not confirmed. Meituan has stated that the model's primary target is agentic commerce, meaning end-to-end autonomous ordering where the system understands intent, queries inventory, negotiates delivery routing, and completes payment without requiring human approval at each step. That is the motive Meituan has put on the record. What has not been independently verified by third-party benchmarking or by any public analysis is the specific technical claim that this use case requires 1.6 trillion parameters rather than a smaller model that has been fine-tuned for the task. A smaller, more focused model might be able to handle the routing and payment workload with considerably less scale. Meituan says it cannot. No independent test confirms that yet. The motive link matters more than almost any other link in this chain, and here is why. If the agentic commerce use case genuinely requires trillion-parameter scale, then every major Chinese consumer services platform with comparable transaction volume has the same economic justification Meituan had. The playbook is sitting in front of them. If the use case does not actually require that scale, and if the training run was partly or primarily a capability demonstration for investors and partners, then the chain shortens considerably. Meituan still built a cluster, the training run still happened, but the replication logic weakens because the motive was situational rather than structural. That is the link this whole chain hangs on. Not the chip count, not the parameter count, the motive. With that uncertainty noted, follow what the confirmed and reported links together imply for link 4, which is where the inversion lands. The standard model of export control leverage rests on a specific industrial map. Restrict the chips. Constrain the frontier labs and the large cloud providers that train the largest models. Slow the capability curve at the places where the curve is steepest. That logic assumes the relevant actors are semiconductor firms and dedicated artificial intelligence research organizations. It was written for a topology where the entities most likely to push the frontier are the entities most obviously dependent on frontier hardware. The most significant Nvidia-Free model completed this year did not come from a chip designer or a dedicated artificial intelligence institute. It came from a platform whose primary internal metric is delivery time. The constraint that was meant to hold the line at the chip level has now produced a training event in a sector the constraint was not written to address. That is the inversion, and its certainty grade is inferred. The inference is grounded in confirmed and reported facts. The training run happened. The builder is a services company. The chip supply is domestic. What is inferred is the structural implication that the leverage calculation behind the export controls no longer maps cleanly onto the industrial landscape because the landscape has already changed. Inferred does not mean wrong. It means the evidence points this way, but the final step is a judgment call rather than a documented conclusion. Link 5 follows from that inferred premise, and it is also inferred. If the economics of a 1.6 trillion parameter training run on domestic chips are viable for a company operating on logistics margins, then those same economics are available to any Chinese consumer platform with comparable transaction volume and comparable procurement access. Ride-hail operators, short video platforms, large e-commerce operators, any platform that generates high-frequency transaction data has a commercial case for autonomous decision-making at scale and has the capital to assemble a comparable cluster, now has a demonstrated template to work from. No second services company run at this scale has been publicly confirmed at the time of writing. That is the gap. The inference is based on the economics and the supply chain availability, not on a reported second event. The question is whether the next procurement cycle surfaces one. Before the close, the chain has two soft spots that a careful reader deserves to hear about explicitly. The first is the chip composition of the cluster. Meituan confirmed the count, roughly 50,000 units, but the specific domestic vendors, the per-chip performance levels, and whether any portion of that cluster sits near the edge of what the export rules would permit are not in the public record. If the cluster leaned on a small number of chips that were themselves borderline under the export thresholds, the characterization of the run as fully domestic softens. That is not confirmed. It is a gap in the reporting. The second soft spot is the motive link, already flagged. Meituan has incentives on both sides of the agentic commerce story. A 1.6 trillion parameter model is also a credible instrument for signaling technical seriousness to investors, to enterprise partners, and to regulators who track domestic capability development. Until there is a deployed agentic product running at scale with measurable transaction outcomes attached to it, the claim that the model was built for operational necessity rather than for signaling remains reported rather than confirmed. Both soft spots have answers that would either extend or shorten the chain's implications. Neither answer is in yet. Here is where the chain lands. A food delivery company trained the largest confirmed Nvidia-Free model on record on domestic chips for a commercial use case that has nothing to do with the geopolitical contest the export controls were written to manage. The restriction did not reach Meituan by design. It reached Meituan because the domestic accelerator supply it accelerated into existence turned out to be accessible to any sufficiently capitalized enterprise buyer. Not just the labs and chip houses on the original target list. LongCat 1.6T is now the first confirmed instance of a consumer services company crossing the trillion parameter threshold on domestic silicon, and that makes it a marker, not just a model. The restriction did not sever the chain at Meituan. It handed Meituan the diagram. The dinner arrived on time. The chip policy did not. Watch the next two procurement cycles among China's major consumer platforms. If a second services company, not a lab, not a cloud giant, not a chip house, announces a comparable training run on domestic silicon, the topology assumption behind the export controls will need to be rewritten in public, not just in policy working groups. If no second run materializes, the question becomes whether Meituan's economics are singular or simply early. Either answer tells you something the current policy framework does not yet account for. If you are tracking this chain, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next link lands when the next cluster comes online.